Here's a particular quiet a woman builds around herself once she's decided love isn't coming back for her. It isn't sadness, exactly. It's more like a house she swept clean and locked from the inside. Every room accounted for, every door bolted, no space left where hope might hide and make a mess of things. Willa Doss lived in a quiet like that for 11 years. She ran the best table in a town nobody chose to be born in. She buried her softness so deep even she forgot the shape of it, and she told anyone who asked, and plenty who didn't, that she was done with marriage the way a person is done with a bad tooth. Pulled clean. Good riddance. And then one spring, half frozen and bleeding, a man came down off the mountain who was more ruin than person. Folks said he'd stopped being able to want anything years ago. Folks said a lot of things. I'm the one who watched it happen, from behind a ledger I had no business writing in. So let me tell you how a woman who'd given up on being anybody's bride ended up standing in the wind at Widow's Notch, listening to a broken man ask her the one question she'd sworn she'd never answer again. The first thing I knew of Silas Vane that spring was the sound his mule made coming down the wrong side of Widow's Notch at an hour when no sane creature should have been on that trail. I keep a ledger, always have. It's meant for horseshoes and oats and the $2 the Hollies boy still owes me, but somewhere along the years it turned into a place I set down people to when I couldn't set them down anywhere else. My wife used to say I noticed everybody and knew nobody, and she wasn't wrong, and she's gone 8 years now, so I suppose the ledger's the closest thing I've got to somebody to tell. I'm Emmett Rowe. I shoe horses in Sable Creek, and I've got a hip that predicts weather better than the almanac. And that night, the hip and the almanac both said stay indoors. The mule said otherwise. I heard it before I saw anything, that stumbling, sliding clatter of a shod animal picking its way down scree it couldn't see, and under it a man's voice, low, not shouting, just talking the beast down the mountain word by word like you'd talk a child off a roof. I got the lantern. I got my coat over my nightshirt, which is a picture I'll spare you. And I stood in the mud of the livery yard, while the dark up the road resolved itself into the worst-looking pair of travelers I'd seen come out of that pass in 20 years. The mule was blown, lathered to a gray foam despite the cold. The man on it wasn't riding so much as staying attached. He had one arm wrapped around the animal's neck and the other pressed flat against his own side, and when the lantern found his face I saw it was the color of tallow, and that there was blood, black in that light, soaked from his ribs down to the knee of his trousers. "You'll want the doctor," I said, which was a stupid thing to say since we didn't have one, and hadn't since old Prout drank himself into the churchyard. The man's eyes came around to me slow, like it cost him. "I'll want," he said, "somewhere to fall down that isn't the road." Then he obliged himself and fell down. Not on the road. Half on it. I got under him the way you get under a load you know is going to hurt, and my hip screamed its opinion, and between the two of us three, counting the mule, who at least stopped moving, we got him out of the dark. Here is the part I still turn over. I did not take him to my place. I've asked myself why 100 times, and the honest answer is small and unflattering. I'm an old man with a bad hip and a cot, and a bleeding stranger is more than a cot can hold. But it's also true that in Sable Creek, when a body needs keeping alive through the night, there is exactly one door you knock on, and it belongs to Willa Doss. She ran the boarding house and the eatery under the same roof, and she was, by common agreement, the most capable person in the valley and the least interested in your gratitude. When I hammered on her door with my boot because both my arms were full of dying trapper, I heard her come down the stairs already talking. Whatever it is, Emmett Rowe, it had better be. She opened the door. She looked at what I was holding. Something passed over her face quick that I didn't have a name for then and only understood much later. Then it was gone and she was Willa again, sleeves already going up. "Kitchen," she said, "not the good table." I want to tell you she was gentle. She wasn't. Gentleness is a thing people can afford who have never had to keep somebody alive with their bare hands and a pot of boiling water. Willa was fast and hard and exact. She cut his shirt off him with a boning knife and didn't flinch at what was under it, which was more than I could say for myself. Something had gone into his side, a snapped branch. We figured later when he told it, driven in by a fall, and it had torn a furrow you could have laid 2 fingers in, and it had been bleeding a good long while. "Hold the light steady or hold it outside," she told me. I held it steady. She worked on him past the point most would have quit. She packed the wound and she stitched it with the curved needle she kept for exactly nobody ever said what. And the whole time the man made almost no sound, which unsettled me worse than screaming would have. He watched the ceiling. Once, when she pressed too hard finding the depth of it, his jaw locked and a sound did come out of him, low, and he said, "Sorry," to her, as if he'd inconvenienced her by having nerves. Willa stopped for half a breath. "Don't apologize to me," she said. "Just keep breathing. That's the only thing I need out of you." He kept breathing. By the time the window went gray, she had him bound and dosed with the last of the laudanum, and moved to the cot in the back room she used for boarders who couldn't pay. I know that's what it was, because I'd slept there myself one bad winter, and she stood in her ruined kitchen with her hands red to the wrist and looked at me like I'd tracked something in. "He can't be moved," she said. 3 days at least, probably more, he'll fever." "I'll pay his keep," I said. "You won't. He will when he wakes, or the town will, or nobody will, and I'll eat the cost same as always." She wiped her hands. "I'm not doing it for pay, Emmett. Don't insult us both." That was Willa. She'd have cut off her own hand before she let you call the thing she'd just done a kindness. He didn't wake right for 2 days. When he did, he was somebody worth writing down. I'd guessed him at 50 from the road. He wasn't. It was the beard and the hard living that aged him. Under it he was maybe 40, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had then had several bad years explained to it very slowly. His hands were the thing you noticed after. The left one was missing the 2 smallest fingers, old loss, healed to smooth stubs, and the backs of both were webbed with the shiny, pulled-tight scarring that only fire leaves. When he saw me looking, he didn't hide them. He'd stopped hiding them a long time ago. But he didn't offer to explain them either, and I'd learned by then not to ask a man about his fire scars unless you wanted to be there for the answer. His name was Silas Vane. He trapped and cut timber up past the notch, alone, and had for years, in a cabin so far up that most people had forgotten a man lived there at all. He'd been felling a leaning pine, he told us, in the flat voice men use for the parts of a story they've made peace with, and the pine had had its own ideas, and he'd gone down the slope with a good deal of it. The branch was the least of what could have happened. He'd bound himself with his own shirt and got on the mule because the alternative was lying under that pine feeding the ravens. And he'd chosen in the moment, ravens later over ravens, now. "That's a long way to ride torn open," Willa said. She'd brought him broth and was standing well back from the cot, arms folded in the doorway, like a woman keeping a fire on the far side of a room. "Wasn't planning to make town," he said. "Planned to make the halfway spring and see how I felt." "And how'd you feel?" A ghost of something moved in his beard, not a smile. The memory of the place a smile used to go. "Felt like riding on," he said. She set the broth down within his reach and stepped back before he could thank her. I could fill a page with the small war those 2 fought over that broth, and over the days after it, and I did in the ledger, though I've lost the exact words. It went like this. He was a man who had spent so long taking nothing from anybody that accepting a bowl of soup near cost him his pride. She was a woman who had spent so long giving without wanting anything, named that the smallest thanks made her leave the room. They were, in other words, 2 people wound out of the same bad thread. And they recognized it in each other the way you recognize your own accent in a stranger's mouth, instantly, and without pleasure. Because here is the thing about Willa Doss that the town knew and told, in the way small towns tell you a person before you meet them. She had come west 11 years back as a bride. Not with a husband, for one. She'd come alone, on the strength of letters, to marry a man named Corbett who'd advertised for a wife in a paper back east, and courted her by mail for the better part of a year in a handwriting she'd later learn wasn't even his own. He'd had the postmaster's clever nephew do it, being barely able to sign his name. She'd read those letters, I'm told, until the folds went soft. She'd sold what little her people left her and bought the passage. And she'd arrived in Sable Creek in a good dress with her hope pinned up neat as her hair to find that Corbett had, 4 days prior, gotten himself killed in a dispute over a card that was probably not even in the deck. She never met him. She stood in the road with her trunk and her folded letters, and a name that belonged to a dead stranger, and the whole town watched her do it. She could have gone home. There was nothing to go home to. So she stayed, and she took work, and inside a few years she'd bought the boarding house off the widow who ran it before her, and she made herself into the one indispensable fact of the town. And whenever some hopeful fool came courting, and they did, she was handsome and formidable, and that's a combination that draws a certain kind of man like flies. She'd tell him, kind the first time and unkind the second, that she'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a dead man once already, and found the experience conclusive on the subject of marriage. She was done. She said it so often and so flat it stopped being a wound and started being a wall, and the town let her have her wall, because everybody's got one and hers was better kept than most. That was the woman keeping Silas Vane alive. He healed slow. His fever broke on the 3rd night, I know because I was there, having got in the habit of stopping by, and I watched Willa sit up with him through the worst of it, not touching him, just close, a lamp turned low, ready. He talked in the fever. Everybody does. Most of it was the mountain, trees, weather, the mule, whose name I learned that night was Gospel, which tells you something about Silas Vane I couldn't have got out of him sober. But once, deep in it, he said 2 names I wrote down without meaning to. Anna, he said, and then softer, breaking on it, Tom. Willa went very still in her chair. I've thought about that stillness a great deal. She could have leaned in. She could have shushed him or held his hand or done any of the small things people do at a fever bed. She did none of them. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the window, and she let him say those names into the dark alone, and I understood, slow, the way I understand most things, that she was not being cold. She was being careful. She knew the shape of a grief a man says only in a fever. She'd been living inside one for 11 years, and she would no more have reached into his than she'd have wanted anyone reaching into hers. He didn't remember saying it. In the morning he was mending and gruff about it and asking after the mule. Now I have to tell you about the town, because a small town is a character in any true story whether it wants to be or not, and Sable Creek surely didn't want to be. By the end of the first week, there wasn't a soul in the valley who didn't know that Willa Doss had a man in her back room. It didn't matter that he was half dead. It didn't matter that I'd carried him there, and that the whole thing was as innocent as a broken leg. What mattered was that Willa Doss, who had made an ironclad public fact of wanting no man, was feeding one soup with her own hands. The Ryerson sisters found reasons to eat at her table 3 times running. The Holly's boy's mother said a thing at the mercantile I won't repeat, and Willa, who heard about everything, heard about that too. I watched it land on her. She didn't crack, but she got harder and faster, and she started leaving Silas's care to the girl she'd hired for the season, Ada, and she stopped going into the back room herself except when she had to. And Silas, who missed nothing, that man, for all he said little, Silas noticed the doorway of his care go empty, and he drew his own conclusions, most of them wrong, and he began to talk about leaving before he could stand. It came to its first head over a shirt. She'd mended his, the one she'd cut off him, the only one he had, patched now where the branch had gone through. She brought it to him folded, set it on the cot's foot and turned to go, and he said to her back, "You've got my thanks, and I'll be off your hands inside the week, and I'll square whatever I owe." She stopped in the doorway. "You'll leave when you can ride without opening that side back up, and not before, and I'll thank you not to make me the villain in your going." "I'm not." "You are. You're standing yourself up straight so you can tell yourself you left before you were a burden. I know the trick, Mr. Vane. I've done the trick. It's a coward's version of pride, and I won't have it under my roof." There was a silence you could have stood a spoon in. Then Silas Vane laughed. It surprised us both, a rough, rusty sound, like a hinge that hadn't turned in years. "That's the truest thing anybody's said to me in about a decade," he said. "And I've been living alone on purpose, so that's saying something." And Willa, I saw it, Willa almost smiled. Caught it. Killed it. But it had been there, the ghost of the girl who'd folded her letters soft, and she left the room fast so neither of us would see the rest of it. That was the turn. If you've ever watched a river go over from freeze to thaw, it's not a thing that happens all at once. It's a crack you hear one night and think nothing of, and then a morning where the ice groans, and then a day the whole thing's moving and you can't say when it started. That laugh was the crack. The thaw took the rest of the month, and it was made of nothing you could point to. It was Silas, able to sit up now. Whittling, his hands couldn't do fine work anymore. The fire had seen to that, but they could still shape a spoon, a peg, and he made himself useful in the small ways a proud man will let himself, mending the things around a house that a busy woman never gets to. It was Willa finding the back room's chores done and saying nothing, and Silas finding his coffee stronger than the season required, and saying nothing. It was two people who had each decided the ledger of their life was closed and balanced, discovering an entry neither had written, and being too frightened and too stubborn to read it aloud. I had a front seat and a bad hip, and I wrote it all down, and I'll tell you, the pleasure I took in it shamed me a little. An old man's got no business being that glad for two people who'd both told him plain they were past all that. Then Silas Vane got well enough to leave, and instead of leaving, he did the bravest and stupidest thing I ever saw a man do, and he did it in front of half the town. It was a Sunday. Willa served a long table on Sundays, boarders and townsfolk both, and the room was full. Silas came out of the back for the first time to a proper meal, dressed, on his feet, gaunt but upright, the mule gospel packed and waiting in my yard because he'd told me that morning, quiet, that it was time, that he'd caused this woman enough trouble and enough talk and he'd not add to either. So he was leaving. That's what he came out to do, take one meal, say one thanks, and go. He stood at the end of the table. Conversation dropped off the way it does. Willa came out of the kitchen with a dish in her hands and saw him standing there in his packed-and-ready state, and I watched something in her face go carefully, deliberately blank, the wall coming up brick by brick right there in front of everyone. And Silas Vane opened his mouth to say a thing he had clearly rehearsed all morning, some clean, brief speech of gratitude and goodbye. And what came out instead, in front of the Ryerson sisters and the Hollies boys' mother and God and everybody, was, "Marry me." The dish did not drop. Willa Doss was not a woman who dropped dishes. She set it down on the table, exactly square, with two hands, in a silence so total I could hear the fire. "You've had a fever," she said. 3 weeks gone," said Silas. "I'm as clear as I get." His scarred hands were shaking. He didn't hide them. "I know how it sounds. I know what I look like, and I know what I've got, which is a cold cabin and a mule and a side that'll ache when it rains for the rest of my life. I've got no business asking you anything. But I've watched you a month, and I've never in my life seen anybody I'd less like to leave, and I decided I'd rather be a fool in front of these good people than a coward on that mule, so." He ran dry, started again. "So, marry me, or don't. But I wasn't going to ride off and never have said it. You could have heard the valley breathe." And Willa Doss, Willa, who had 2,000 miles of reasons and 11 years of practice, and a room full of witnesses to be strong in front of, Willa looked at that broken, scarred, shaking man who'd said the one word she'd built her whole hard life around never hearing again. And she said, in a voice I'd never heard her use, small and awful and true, "No." She said it, and she picked her dish back up, and she carried it into the kitchen, and she shut the door. Silas Vane stood there one more second. Then he nodded once to the room, like a man accepting a verdict he'd expected, and he walked out to my yard, and he got on gospel, and he rode up toward Widow's Notch in the failing light with his back very straight. I sat in that dead quiet room, and I did not write a single word in the ledger. Some things you don't trust yourself to set down until you know how they end. I thought that was the end. I was wrong about a great deal that spring, but I was never so wrong as I was about that. The mistake people make about a woman like Willa Doss is thinking her no came from not wanting to say yes. I made that mistake myself, sitting in her dead quiet dining room the night Silas Vane rode off. I thought, well, there it is, she meant it all along, she's past all that, and this poor ruined man just learned it the hard way in front of the whole town. I thought I'd watched a wall hold. What I'd actually watched, I know now, was a woman so frightened of hope that she'd killed it in the cradle to keep it from growing up and dying on her again. That's a thing you can only see from the far side. At the time it just looked like no. She didn't come out of that kitchen for the rest of the evening. Ada served the table, wide-eyed, and the town ate fast and left faster, all of them dying to be the first to carry the news down the road, and I sat there like an old fixture until the last of them was gone. Then I knocked on the kitchen door. "Go home, Emmett," she said through it. "I will directly. Go home now." I went home, but I'm a stubborn man too in my quiet way, and the next morning I came back with a shoe I claimed needed her forge. She kept a little one, for pots, which was a lie, and she knew it was a lie, and she let me in anyway, which was the first thing that gave me hope. She looked like she hadn't slept. She was moving around her kitchen doing the hard, useless cleaning people do when they can't sit with themselves, and I set my false errand on the bench and I said, because somebody had to and it wasn't going to be either of them, "You want to tell me why you said no to a good man who'd walk through fire for you?" Because from where I sat, that wasn't a no from a woman who doesn't want him. She stopped scrubbing. "He already walked through one fire," she said, not turning around. "Did you see his hands?" "I saw them. He had a wife, Emmett, Anna, and a boy, Tom. The cabin burned 6-7 years back before he came up to the Notch." Her voice was flat as a frozen pond and just as ready to crack. "He got the boy's window open. That's how his hands are like that. He got the window open and the roof came down and he didn't get either of them out, and he's lived alone on the top of a mountain ever since because he decided he doesn't get to have anybody anymore. Ada got it out of him, bit by bit. He didn't mean to tell it." I stood there. "So don't," she said, and now her voice did crack right down the middle. "Don't you tell me I said no to a man who doesn't understand. He understands better than anybody alive. That's why I couldn't. Do you see? A man like that, you don't get to fail a man like that. If I said yes and I couldn't if I wasn't enough, if I froze up like I've frozen up for 11 years, if I let him down the way I've let everybody down who ever tried to get past my—" She put the scrub brush down very carefully. "He's already lost the one thing a man's allowed to lose. I won't be his second. I won't be the proof that he was right to stop trying. I'd rather he think me cold than know me for a coward." And there it was, the whole of it. She hadn't refused him because she didn't love him. She'd refused him because she did, and because she'd decided, with the terrible arithmetic of a person who's been broken once and rebuilt herself alone, that her love wasn't safe enough to risk on a man who'd already been burned to the bone. That is the heaviest thing I know how to tell you. That sometimes the cruelest thing a good person can do, they do out of love, to spare the other from themselves. I didn't have wisdom for her. I'm a farrier. But I had one thing and I gave it to her, and it's the only piece of that whole spring I'm proud of. "Willa," I said, "you keep saying you'd let him down. You froze up for 11 years, you said. Girl, you kept that man alive on your own kitchen table with your bare hands and didn't so much as slow down. You sat with his fever 3 nights. You mended his only shirt. In what world is that a woman who freezes?" I picked up my false horseshoe. You're not scared you'll fail him, you already didn't. You're scared it'll go the way it went before, and I can't tell you it won't, because nobody can tell anybody that. That's not what a yes is. A yes is just being brave enough to not know. She didn't answer, but she didn't tell me to go home again either. And when I left, she was standing at her window, looking up toward the notch, and I've never in my life wanted so badly to be the sort of man who could make a thing come out right. The weather made the decision for her. It usually does in the mountains. 4 days after Silas rode off, a spring storm came down out of the north the way they do up here. No warning worth the name. Just a morning that goes the color of a bruise and a temperature that drops 30 degrees in an hour and snow, driving sideways in May like the season had reconsidered. It was the kind of storm that killed people who'd lived here their whole lives, caught out with the wrong coat. And every soul in Sable Creek, warming their hands by their own stoves, had the same thought at the same time, whether they'd have admitted it or not. There was a hurt man alone at the top of the mountain, a man with a barely healed side and a bad handful of fingers, and if that cabin's roof or that firewood or that mending body wasn't right, nobody would know until the thaw showed them. Willa knew it first. Willa was already in her barn. I got there, I'd gone down to check on her. God help me. I'd got in the habit. I got there to find her cinching a saddle on her mare with the particular fury of a person who has finished arguing with herself and lost. You can't ride the notch in this, I said. Watch me. Willa, it's suicide. You don't even know he's in trouble. He's lived up there years, he knows storms. He fells timber he shouldn't and rides torn open and gets his hands burned off saving people, she said, hauling the cinch. That is a man who does not correctly value his own life, Emmett, and I have spent 1 week too many pretending I don't know exactly what that's like. She turned on me and her eyes were wet and blazing at once. I said no to spare him. Do you understand what I did? I decided for him. I decided he was better off without me because I was too much a coward to find out if I was wrong. And now there's a storm and I might have spared him right into a snowdrift. And I will not. I will not sit by my warm fire and let the last thing I ever did to that man be turn him away. There's no arguing with that. There's only going along or getting out of the way. I'm too old and too lame to have been much use on that trail and we both knew it. So I did the one thing I could. I gave her my heavy coat and the good lantern, and I told her the safe line up the last pitch where the trail forks and the left fork looks right and isn't. And I stood in the driving snow and watched Willa Doss ride up into Widow's Notch after a man she'd refused in front of the whole town. And I prayed, which I hadn't done sincerely since I buried my wife. I'll tell you what she found because she told me, later, once and never again, and I've kept it careful all these years. She found the cabin standing, but only just. Silas had made it home before the storm, but the ride and the cold had opened his side again, that stubborn wound, the one she'd stitched, and by the time the snow came he was fevered and slow, and he'd let the fire burn low because getting up hurt, and getting would hurt worse, and a man alone with a fever makes bad small decisions that add up. She said when she came through the door on the wind he was sitting against the wall by a dying fire with the mule's blanket over him, too far gone to be surprised, and he looked up at her out of the fever exactly the way he'd looked up at me the first night on the road. And he said, she swore this is what he said, and it's so like him I believe it. You'll want the doctor. We don't have one, Willa told him, dropping to her knees in front of the fire. You'll have to make do with me. She built the fire back. She got the wound clean again and dressed, and she got broth into him, and she got him warm, and she stayed, because the storm shut the pass for 2 days and there was nowhere on God's earth to go. And there is a great deal that can be said between two frightened, stubborn people in a snowed-in cabin with nothing to do but keep each other alive. And I wasn't there, and it isn't mine to invent. I only know this. When the pass cleared and I got word up to them that the town was fretting, it wasn't Silas who sent an answer down. It was Willa. 3 words in her hard, exact hand, on the back of one of my own ledger pages she must have had in the coat pocket. Tell them yes. They came down off the mountain together a week later, both of them alive, which in that country in that season was its own kind of miracle, and they were married by the circuit preacher the next time he passed through, in Willa's dining room, at the good table, with the whole town crammed in and the Ryerson sisters crying, and the Holly's boy's mother saying something for once that was fit to repeat. It wasn't a fairy story. I want to be honest with you, because Willa and Silas were honest people and they'd not thank me for prettying it. They were two hard, scarred, grief-worn souls who'd each been alone a long time and had the ruts to prove it, and being married didn't sand those away. They argued. He went too quiet and she went too sharp, and there were mornings the old walls came up in both of them at once and they had to find their way back down. He never got his hands back. She never fully lost the flinch of a woman who'd learned to expect the worst. Some nights, I'm told, he still said Anna and Tom in his sleep, and Willa, who'd once sat perfectly still and let a fevered stranger grieve alone rather than intrude. Willa learned to lie there in the dark beside him and put her hand flat against his scarred back, not to wake him, not to fix it, just so that when he surfaced out of that old fire he'd surface into something warm. That's the part I think about most, not the proposal in front of the whole town, not even the ride up the notch. That. A woman who'd spent 11 years bolting every door in the house, learning to leave one open in the dark. Silas Vane told me a thing once, years on, when his beard had gone gray and his side ached true to every rain just like he'd promised. We were in my yard and gospel the mule was long dead, and there was a new mule that Silas complained about, and out of nothing he said, "You know she near didn't come up that mountain." "I know it," I said. "I was there when she saddled up." She told me why she said no that day at the table. Took her 3 years to tell me. He looked up toward the notch the way she used to. She said no because she loved me too much to risk it, and I've thought about that more than a sane man ought. He worked his ruined hand slow, the way he did when he was turning something over. All those years up there alone, I thought I was sparing the world the trouble of me. Turns out the two of us were doing the very same thing to each other from opposite ends of the same mountain. Sparing, deciding for folks, calling it kindness. "What changed it?" I said. He was quiet a while. "A storm," he said, "and a woman too stubborn to let her own good sense win." He didn't say the rest. He didn't have to. There are things a man that private will hand you, and things he leaves in the wind at the top of the mountain where they came from, and I'd learned by then not to reach into either one. I'm an old man now, older than Silas got to be. I've still got the ledger. I turned to that page not long ago, the fever page, the one where I wrote Anna and Tom without meaning to, and below it in a different day's ink, where I finally trusted the ending enough to set it down. And I found I couldn't add anything. It was all already there in her hand, on the back of the very same page, small and hard and braver than anything I ever managed. Tell them yes. She'd given up on marriage. She'd sworn it, meant it, built a whole hard good life on it. And then a broken man asked her a broken question at the worst possible moment in front of the worst possible crowd, and she said no, and she meant that too,